Why would a command center filled with America's sharpest minds decide that 480 of their most elite operators were already dead? The words hung in the stale air like a verdict. No one wanted to say aloud, but everyone already felt written in stone. All extraction teams withdraw immediately. The 480 are designated operational casualties. The transmission cut through the command center like a blade, a sterile voice, official, absolute, the kind of voice that didn't shake when it condemned hundreds of men to die in silence. Screens glowed a dull blue across the room. Every dot of light represented a man still fighting on the ground. Blue dots, surrounded by a sea of red indicators that thickened by the minute. The map didn't need interpretation. It showed desperation in pixels. Colonel Thaddeus Blackwood sat at the center of the storm. His face was carved by years of decisions that never left him once he signed off on them. He didn't move when the order came down, didn't protest the finality in the general's voice. He only leaned forward, elbows on the edge of the console, and stared at the dots as though he could will them back to safety. 480 lives, gone with a line of text across a screen. "Sir, intel confirms enemy strength at 2,000, Major Kendrick reported, his voice steady, like a man choosing discipline over panic. All extraction routes compromised, anti-aircraft placements confirmed along the ridges." That number, 2,000, settled over the room like the weight of wet concrete. The colonel's jaw clenched. Assessment. Extraction probability under 15%. Casualty rate projected at 70%, not including current losses. Kendrick paused. "Unacceptable, sir." The colonel muttered the word again, but quieter this time. Unacceptable, as if saying it twice might strip it of truth. And still the screen glowed, blue swallowed by red. On the other side of the world, on a windswept ridge 18 miles from the valley, Captain Ezrain Frost lay prone behind her rifle, her cheek pressed into the worn stock, her gloved hands making micro-adjustments as though she had all the time in the world. But she could see what others only debated on screens. Through her scope, the valley pulsed with tracer fire. She could see defensive positions caving under relentless waves, could see shadows dragging wounded behind broken walls, could see the slow collapse of 480 souls who had been written off with the stroke of a pen. Her radio hissed. "Observation post Delta, immediate withdrawal, all posts returning, exfil en route." She didn't move, only adjusted the windage on her scope. Her voice, when it finally crackled back, was calm, too calm for the chaos beneath her. "Command, this is Captain Frost at Op Delta. I've identified a potential corridor on the eastern ridge. Enemy presence minimal. Request permission to provide overwatch for rescue." The colonel's voice came through hard, sharp. "Negative, Captain. All personnel withdraw. That's a direct order." Her finger rested on the trigger steady. She didn't answer. Not yet. Not when an enemy commander below barked orders to a mortar team setting up on the ridge. She exhaled. Her crosshairs settled on his temple. "Captain Frost, acknowledge withdrawal." Her breath steadied, a pause long enough to taste the line she was about to cross. Then a crack split the valley. The commander below dropped like a stone. The mortar team froze, and a second later her next round snapped into the spotter's chest, breaking the chain before it could tighten. In the command center, alarms flared. "Delta, did you engage?" Frost clicked her radio once, then held it in her hand. Slowly, deliberately, she reached down and flicked the power off. Static, then silence. From that moment she was cut off. No orders, no permission, no safety net. She was already guilty of disobeying command, and she knew what that meant. Court-martial if she lived. Dishonor even if she saved them. But what was worse? To live with chains of protocol, or to live with the knowledge that she had let them all die while she obeyed. Master Chief Beckett, her spotter, shifted beside her. His eyes said everything his mouth didn't. "We're really doing this." Frost chambered another round, her face unreadable. "I didn't hear any orders. Radio must be down." He almost laughed, almost, but his grin faded when he saw her eyes, hard, steady, as if she'd already decided how far she was willing to go. "Wind 3 knots southwest," he murmured, settling into position with his spotting scope. Her shot cracked again, another enemy down. "They won't send rescue with the current threat assessment," she said, chambering her next round. Her voice didn't rise, didn't harden, it was flat, clinical. "So we change the assessment, one shot at a time." Back at the forward base, Colonel Blackwood slammed a fist against the console. "Who the hell is still out there?" "Triangulated source, sir. It's Captain Frost." She never withdrew. "She's disobeying a direct order," Blackwood snapped. But his anger was thin. It cracked at the edges, the way a man sounded when anger was just a mask for fear. Because the data was clear. Casualties were shifting, enemy formations splintering, their perfect net fraying one thread at a time. Major Kendrick spoke quietly. "She's making them think they're fighting against more than one sniper, creating the illusion of a larger force." It was impossible, reckless, suicidal, and yet. The general's face appeared on the screen, drawn tight. "What's this about unauthorized fire?" "Captain Frost," Blackwood said, each syllable reluctant. The general's eyes narrowed. "Why does that name sound familiar?" "SEAL Team 6, Sniper Division, first woman to qualify." Kendrick hesitated, much of her records classified. Recognition flickered across the general's face. "Keep monitoring. I'll make calls." By dawn, the story of the valley had changed. What had been a slaughterhouse now shifted toward a fragile possibility. Frost's impossible shots, 500 meters, 1,700, each one cleaner than the last, were carving a corridor through chaos. From the ground, battered SEALs began to move, carrying their wounded toward the east, toward the ridge she had opened, toward hope they hadn't had hours before. And still, no one knew how long one woman could hold back 2,000. Frost adjusted her scope, her voice low enough for only Beckett to hear. "We're not fighting for a medal, not for orders, not even for survival." Her finger rested on the trigger again. "We're fighting so 480 men don't die knowing they were abandoned." The shot rang out. Another commander fell, another chance bought with the weight of her defiance. And as the sun crept over the ridge, its first light catching the barrel of her rifle, Captain Ezrain Frost knew one truth. There were some orders that didn't deserve to be obeyed. How long could one woman defy 2,000 without being crushed beneath them? The question circled the command center like smoke. Every new report only sharpened the disbelief. Enemy mortar fire neutralized. Communications relay taken out. Leadership ranks fractured by invisible bullets. It wasn't possible, not at that distance, not at that pace, not by a sniper who, by all logic, should already be withdrawing. Colonel Blackwood paced the length of the room, his boots heavy against the concrete floor. "Captain Frost is jeopardizing the operation. She's disobeying direct orders. She's alone. She'll be overrun." Major Kendrick, still bent over the tactical feed, didn't look up. "And yet, sir, her actions are creating the only viable window for extraction." The word stung. Truth always did when it stood at odds with protocol. General Wainwright appeared again on the screen, his voice flat, betraying nothing of the unease in his eyes. "Colonel, your orders remain unchanged. Task Force Echo is declared a loss. You will not authorize unauthorized rescues based on the actions of a rogue sniper. Is that understood?" Blackwood wanted to answer. He wanted to echo back the words drilled into him across decades of service, but his throat constricted, because every update from the valley screamed another story. On the rocky ridge, Captain Frost shifted her position, crawling across jagged stone to avoid the triangulated fire now hammering her last nest. Dust clung to her uniform. Her lips were dry from the cold wind, but her eye never left the scope. She found her next target, a commander waving his men into formation, unaware that each wave he sent forward was being cut short by an unseen hand. Crack! He folded, another piece pulled from the enemy's machine. 74 confirmed, Beckett murmured, tallying under his breath, though numbers had long since blurred. That's what half their leadership structure. Not enough. Frost's voice was low, hoarse from hours of silence broken only by whispered adjustments. Not until the corridor's clear. She shifted again, ignoring the ache in her shoulder, the dull burn in her legs. She didn't feel tired. She felt sharpened, as if every fiber of her being had condensed into the barrel of her rifle, into the squeeze of her trigger finger, into the space between one heartbeat and the next. Below, the SEALs felt it too. Lieutenant Commander Riker dragged one of his wounded across the dirt, gritting his teeth through his own pain. For hours, he had thought they were abandoned, written off by the very command structure he'd bled to serve. But now something was different. The enemy was stumbling. Officers cut down before they could finish orders. Mortar crews silenced before the first round fired. It was impossible, but someone was out there. Who the hell's covering us? A young SEAL gasped, clutching his bleeding arm as Riker hauled him toward cover. Riker didn't answer. He didn't need to. The glimmer in his eyes, the grit in his jaw said everything. Whoever it was, they weren't alone anymore. Back at the forward base, the command center door opened. Not another officer, not another pilot, the Secretary of Defense himself. Lancaster's presence froze the room in an instant, a man whose word reshaped missions. "Status," he demanded. Colonel Blackwood saluted, his jaw tight. "Sir, unauthorized engagement from Captain Ezrain Frost at Observation Post Delta. She's disrupting enemy formations." Disrupting. Lancaster's voice was a blade. "Sir, she's created the impression of a larger opposing force. Enough confusion to buy time for Task Force Echo." The secretary stepped closer to the tactical display. The screen flickered with blue and red, lines of fire shifting positions. He studied it without speaking for several long seconds. Then, "General Quinley, what does this remind you of?" The older man at his side leaned forward. His face was grim. Coronel Valley, 7 years ago, 83 Army Rangers surrounded, declared unsalvageable. One sniper refused the order to withdraw, created corridors, saved all but 2. The room shifted, officers straightened, heads turned, a name ghosted across the silence. The ghost of Coronel. Lancaster's eyes lifted. That was her, wasn't it? Blackwood swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Then she's done it before." Lancaster's gaze hardened. "And you should be asking why you're not supporting her instead of trying to stop her." The weight of those words didn't settle on Blackwood alone. It echoed across every operator in the room, every man who had calculated acceptable losses, every officer who had silently signed off on death sentences disguised as strategy. And still across the ridge, Frost fired again. Each shot wasn't just a bullet, it was defiance given form. But she wasn't untouched by what she was doing. Between reloads, she felt the tremor in her hands. Not fear, not yet. It was memory. A memory of faces she had failed to save in Coronel, the 2 she hadn't reached in time. Their eyes still haunted her. That was why she stayed silent now. Why she would rather die here than leave these men behind. "Captain," Beckett whispered beside her, his voice tight. "They're pushing closer, 50 at least, converging. They've spotted our position." Frost adjusted her scope, exhaled. "Then we move." "Move where?" "Somewhere they don't expect." She fired one last shot, then crawled backwards, slinging her rifle over her shoulder. Together, she and Beckett slipped across the rocks, moving like shadows despite the chaos around them. She chose her new perch carefully, an angle that not only kept covering fire on the SEALs but also drew enemy attention away from their wounded evacuation. Her radio stayed off. The silence was deliberate now. The only voices she allowed in were her own doubts, her own convictions. Back in the valley, Lieutenant Commander Riker reached the eastern ridge with a small cluster of his men. He stared up through the haze and dust, and for the first time in hours he saw open ground. A corridor, narrow, dangerous, but possible. "Get the wounded moving," he ordered, his voice breaking with something between exhaustion and disbelief. "Somebody's fighting for us. We're not done yet." The words carried like fire through his men. They began to move faster, harder, carrying brothers across broken earth, limping, bleeding, but alive. Hope had a weight to it, a momentum, and once it started rolling, nothing, not even 2,000 enemies, could stop it. In the command center, the numbers began to shift. Red dots faltered, blue dots pushed forward. Colonel Blackwood leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles blanched. He had called Frost reckless, a liability, but now he saw the truth. One woman, one rifle, and an entire war was bending around her choice. The Secretary of Defense spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Sometimes protocol is the real enemy." And across the ridge, Captain Frost chambered another round, her eyes burning with the same thought. If rules meant 480 men would be abandoned, then the rules were wrong. And she was going to prove it, one impossible shot at a time. How do you hold on to hope when command itself has already buried you? Down in the valley, the SEALs had stopped asking for updates. Their radios carried only static and denials. The last clear order they'd heard from command was final: no extraction, no rescue. They were to fight until they couldn't, and then nothing. Lieutenant Commander Riker sat with his back against a wall of stone, his chest heaving as he pressed gauze against the wound in his side. Around him, men groaned, whispered, prayed. Their ammunition was dwindling, their rations already gone. The sound of distant mortars promised a closing noose. But then something changed. A sharp crack echoed across the ridges, clean, distant, precise. One enemy officer dropped mid-command, his words dying with him. Another shot followed seconds later. A radio operator crumpled beside his set. Then silence, only long enough for panic to ripple through the enemy ranks. Riker's men looked at each other. Was that us? "Negative," Riker said, though a faint light sparked in his eyes. "That's someone else." More shots followed, not sporadic, not wild, surgical. One after another, each like a scalpel cutting arteries the enemy thought untouchable. It wasn't chaos, it was orchestration. "Whoever it is," Riker muttered, dragging himself upright, "they're fighting for us." On the ridge, Captain Frost stayed motionless after her last shot, her breathing controlled, her cheek pressed to the rifle as if the weapon itself were part of her body. Her world narrowed to the tunnel of her scope. The chaos below shrank into ordered patterns, targets isolated from the swarm. Each man she eliminated wasn't just an enemy. It was one less barrier between her brothers and life. Her finger steadied on the trigger again. Crack, another commander fell. She didn't flinch when return fire peppered the rocks around her. She learned long ago that the sound of bullets striking stone was less terrifying than the silence that followed when you hesitated. Master Chief Beckett shifted beside her, his spotting scope locked in. 17 down in this sector. They're diverting forces. They think we're a whole unit. "Let them," Frost reloaded. "The bigger they think we are, the more ground the SEALs gain." For a heartbeat, her gaze lingered on the valley, on the blue dots of exhausted men she couldn't see but knew were there. She could almost feel their desperation in her own chest. "They'll start moving soon," she whispered, almost to herself. "They already are," Beckett replied. He was right. Down below, Riker had ordered his men to shift toward the eastern ridge, the very corridor Frost was carving. It was dangerous, it was thin, but it was a chance. And chance was enough. At the forward base, the tension cracked louder than any gunfire. Colonel Blackwood stood stiffly at the console, torn between orders and the growing truth playing out on the screen. Enemy casualties mounting, Major Kendrick reported. Patterns suggest deliberate elimination of command nodes. Whoever's engaging out there knows exactly what they're doing. It's Frost, Blackwood admitted. General Wayright's voice snarled through the comm line. Then shut her down. She is undermining this operation. She is disobeying orders. The Secretary of Defense cut in sharply. No, she's rewriting the operation you already failed. A hush swept the room. Even Blackwood's breath stilled. Lancaster stepped forward, eyes locked on the tactical feed. Look at them. They were collapsing. Now they're moving. You declared them lost. She's proving you wrong. Wayright's jaw tightened, his pride cracking in real time. One sniper cannot alter the outcome of 2,000. Then explain what you're seeing, Lancaster fired back. Explain the corridor opening right now. Explain why those men aren't dead. No one answered, because everyone knew. Captain Frost was shifting the weight of the battle alone. But she wasn't invincible. Even as she relocated positions, enemy forces tightened their dragnet. Beckett scanned with his scope, his voice grim. They're triangulating. 50 hostiles converging on this ridge. They know we're here. Frost didn't look up. She chambered another round. Then we keep moving until they can't keep up. You'll run out of ground before they run out of bodies. I'll run out of ground after I buy them enough time. She said it simply, like a weather report. No dramatics, no fear, just fact. Still between shots, she felt it creeping in, the cost. Her arms ached. Her vision blurred at the edges from hours behind the scope. Her body screamed for rest she could not afford. She remembered Coronel Valley, remembered the faces of 2 rangers she hadn't reached in time, the ones she visited every year at Arlington. They had been enough to haunt her every night since. Not again, not this time. Her scope settled, crack, another enemy fell. Below, Riker's voice cut across the ground team comms, ragged but fierce. Keep moving. Someone up there's fighting for us. Don't waste it. His men obeyed, staggering, dragging wounded, pushing past exhaustion. Hope carried them farther than orders ever had. At the base, Colonel Blackwood couldn't stop himself anymore. He straightened, voice firm. Launch air assets. General Wayright's voice cut in instantly. Colonel, that's a direct violation of. Sir, Blackwood interrupted, the words tasting foreign but right. I gave up on them too early. I won't do it again. Lancaster's eyes narrowed, but with approval. Then do it, support her. Give those men a chance. Blackwood turned to his operators. Scramble helicopters, prep the QRF. Frost just bought us an extraction. The room exploded into motion. Pilots sprinted. Crews armed birds with ordnance. Hope, once denied, now lit the base like a firestorm. And across the ridge, Frost didn't hear any of it. Her radio remained off. Her world was only the crack of her rifle, the shift of her scope, the steady rhythm of her breath. Captain, Beckett said softly, as if afraid the words themselves might break the spell, do you think they'll even remember who saved them? Frost didn't answer immediately. She tracked her next shot, squeezed, watched another enemy collapse. Then finally she whispered, doesn't matter if they remember me. What matters is they remember they weren't abandoned. And in that moment, she realized something. It wasn't just about saving 480 men. It was about saving the soul of what they all fought for. If she failed, then orders would forever outweigh lives. Protocol would stand taller than loyalty. And every man who went into battle afterward would wonder if he, too, might be written off as an acceptable loss. Not while she breathed. The crack of her rifle echoed again, rolling through the valley like a promise. And for the first time since the order had come down, hope spread, not as rumor, not as speculation, but as undeniable fact. The 480 were not alone. Why does a single act of defiance ripple louder than 1,000 orders? In the silence between rifle cracks, that question pulsed across the battlefield. The enemy had numbers. They had artillery. They had a plan calculated to smother 480 SEALs until nothing remained. And yet, everything began unraveling because of one woman who refused to obey. Captain Frost lay prone on a new perch she and Beckett had carved out of sharp stone and loose dust. Her body screamed with fatigue, every nerve strung tighter than wire, but her scope remained steady. Through its glass, she watched the enemy panic. Officers hesitated to stand. Mortar teams fumbled with rounds. Troops glanced skyward as though waiting for an invisible army that didn't exist. Only one sniper, only one rifle. And yet to them, it looked like ghosts surrounding the valley. 70 meters east, Beckett murmured through clenched teeth, sweat dripping down his brow as he tracked movement through the spotting scope. Squad trying to flank Echo's wounded. Frost shifted, breath steady. Crack. One went down. Crack. Another. She reloaded with mechanical efficiency, the sound of the bolt sliding forward like a heartbeat against the chaos. Flank neutralized, Beckett confirmed. She nodded once, saying nothing. Below, Lieutenant Commander Riker's battered unit moved toward the eastern ridge. They were broken, limping, dragging comrades across uneven terrain, but they were moving. Frost's shots opened windows that didn't exist an hour ago. Every kill widened a seam. Every enemy hesitation bought seconds. Seconds became meters. Meters became hope. Riker shouted over the cacophony, his voice raw. "Keep moving. Someone's clearing the way. Don't stop now." The men followed, not because orders told them to, but because the impossible was happening before their eyes. At the forward base, the tension had fractured into urgency. Screens updated with shifting data, enemy positions collapsing where Frost's rifle spoke. "Confirmed, sir, eastern corridor opening," Major Kendrick reported. "Enemy artillery disrupted. Anti-aircraft positions eliminated, 17 and counting." Colonel Blackwood leaned in, his voice measured but resolute. "Prep the birds, we're going in." General Wainwright's voice cut across the comm system like a whip. "Colonel Blackwood, I forbid this. Do you hear me? Task Force Echo is operationally dead. You will not risk additional assets." Blackwood turned toward the screen, his jaw tight. For years, he had followed every chain of command without question. Orders had been his compass. But staring at the display now, at 480 men clawing toward life because of one woman, he realized something his career had never let him admit. Orders could be wrong. "With respect, sir," he said, his voice steady. "We already risked more when we declared them dead." Wainwright's face darkened. "Colonel." But Lancaster stepped forward, his tone final. "Launch the rescue, that's an order." The room erupted into action. Flight crews sprinted. Blackhawks roared to life on the tarmac, their blades slicing the air. Pilots briefed in rapid-fire sentences, their eyes lit with something rare, belief. For the first time since the disaster began, they weren't flying toward a funeral. They were flying toward a fight worth having. On the ridge, Frost adjusted again, biting down on fatigue. Her vision tunneled. Hours of focus blurred her edges, but she forced herself sharp with every breath. "Captain," Beckett said, his voice softer now, like he was speaking to the ghost of someone already slipping away. "You can't keep this up forever." "I don't need forever," Frost whispered, tracking her next shot. "I just need long enough." Her rifle cracked. Another enemy officer collapsed mid-shout, his words dissolving into dust. Back in the valley, one of Riker's men stumbled, dragging another wounded SEAL on his back. His legs buckled. He nearly collapsed. Then another crack echoed from the ridge, silencing the squad that had sighted them. He looked up, chest heaving, and for the first time since hell had descended on them, he smiled. "She's still with us," he rasped. No one corrected him. They didn't need to know her name to know what she was doing. In the command helicopter, Colonel Blackwood strapped in, headset crackling as pilots confirmed readiness. He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling the weight of what he was about to do. A man who had once believed in clean numbers and calculated losses now carried something heavier: guilt. Guilt for the moment he had nearly accepted 480 lives as expendable. Now he swore he wouldn't make that mistake again. "Colonel," the pilot's voice broke through, "birds are ready, QRF locked in." "Then let's go get our people." The convoy of helicopters thundered skyward, rotors chopping the air as they streaked toward the mountains. Back on the ridge, Frost spotted movement that made her stomach twist. Enemy squads converging, not toward the SEALs, but toward her. She adjusted, fired, dropped 3, but the wave didn't slow. "They've found us," Beckett muttered, his voice grim. 50 at least, maybe more." Frost chambered another round, her voice flat. "Then this is where we make our stand." Beckett turned his eyes toward her, hesitation written in the lines of his face. "You know what happens if we don't make it out." Frost didn't look at him. She fired again. Crack. "Better I go down fighting for them than live knowing I left them behind." Her words weren't bravado, they were fact, a truth heavier than bullets. The enemy crept closer. Gunfire cracked against stone. Dust filled the air. Still, Frost's rifle spoke with terrifying precision, each shot carving another second, another chance. In the valley, Riker dragged another wounded man forward, his own legs trembling. His comm crackled alive with the voice of a pilot. "Echo, this is Blackhawk Squadron. We're inbound to your position. Hold your corridor." Riker froze, his eyes widened. Then he shouted so every man around him could hear, "We're not alone. Air support's coming. Move." A roar rose from men who had been on the edge of despair. They staggered faster, bleeding, limping, but alive. The corridor Frost had carved now stretched toward salvation. In the sky, the helicopters streaked low between ridges, hugging terrain to avoid detection. Pilots scanned instruments, sweat running down their necks. They knew the risk. Anti-aircraft fire still dotted the ridges. The odds were brutal, but they also knew one thing: Captain Frost had already cut down 17 of those guns. Enough to make the impossible, maybe possible. At the base, General Warite paced like a caged animal. His voice hissed through clenched teeth. "This is insubordination, treason. You're risking the integrity of—" Lancaster's interruption was ice cold. "The only thing at risk here, General, is your career. And frankly, compared to 480 men, it isn't worth much." The general went silent. On the ridge, Beckett reloaded his spotter's rifle, handing Frost fresh magazines without needing to be asked. The enemy pressed closer, rounds snapping past their heads, stone splintering in sprays. "Captain, we're running dry." "Then make every shot count." Her next bullet split the valley air, silencing another squad leader. But even as she fired, she knew the truth: she was trading her life for theirs, one magazine at a time. And for the first time in years, she didn't regret it. The thunder of rotor blades grew louder in the distance, echoing across the ridges. The first Blackhawks appeared, sleek shadows rising against the burning horizon. The men below erupted in cheers, though most were too exhausted to lift more than their rifles in salute. Rescue had come, not because command had decreed it, but because one woman refused to let them be forgotten. From her perch, Captain Frost whispered under her breath, a vow no one else would hear. "You're getting out of here, every last one of you." Her scope found another target, her trigger finger steadied. The crack of her rifle echoed across the valley again, as the helicopters descended into hell. What does it feel like when salvation finally appears, only to demand a heavier price than hell itself? The roar of helicopter rotors thundered through the valley, slicing through smoke and gunfire. To the broken men of Task Force Echo, the sound was like oxygen to drowning lungs. They stumbled toward the ridge, every step dragging blood and exhaustion, but for the first time in hours, their eyes lifted. Salvation was here. Lieutenant Commander Riker's voice rasped through cracked lips as he hauled another wounded man across his shoulders. "Blackhawks inbound. Hold your ground. We're getting out." The words spread like fire across the battered force. Men who had been crawling now staggered to their feet. Those who could still fight raised their rifles higher. Those too wounded to move clung tighter to their brothers. Above, 6 Blackhawks cut through the smoke like dark angels, descending into the corridor Captain Frost had carved. They moved in tight formation, engines straining, rotors beating the air like war drums. But salvation did not come quietly. The enemy reacted with fury. Tracer rounds slashed upward from ridges, streaks of fire tearing at the sky. Heavy weapons mounted on concealed positions unleashed volleys that shook the mountains themselves. The valley erupted with every sound of death it could muster. Inside the lead helicopter, Colonel Blackwood gripped the seat frame, headset pressed tight to his ears as reports flooded in. Bird 3 taking fire. Engine hit, stabilizing. Suppression fire, another pilot barked. Door gunners leaned out, miniguns roaring streams of light into the ridges, tearing apart enemy positions. Smoke, dust, and blood painted the horizon. And through it all, one sound cut sharper than any machine gun. Crack! From her perch, Captain Frost's rifle sang, every shot precise, deliberate, merciless. She didn't waste ammunition on chaos. She hunted the threats that mattered, the RPG operator kneeling in the shadows, the heavy gunner lining up on a Blackhawk, the officer signaling a flank. One by one, she cut the strings of the enemy's assault. 17 anti-air down, Beckett reported, his voice hoarse. That's another squad neutralized. Frost didn't reply. Her eyes were locked in, her face pale, her lips pressed thin. Each shot cost her more than energy. It cost pieces of her soul, because she knew she wasn't shooting to kill. She was shooting to buy seconds. Seconds for brothers she might never meet again. "Captain," Beckett muttered, reloading another magazine with shaking hands. "They're closing in on our position." "I know," she chambered her next round. Down below, the first helicopter flared hard, landing in a storm of dust and fire. Door gunners kept their barrels hot as SEALs staggered aboard, dragging wounded, shouting over the thunder. Riker shoved men ahead of him, ignoring the blood soaking his own uniform. "Get on! Move, move, move!" The ground shook as another Blackhawk descended, rotors tearing debris into a cyclone. Wounded were lifted, carried, thrown into waiting arms. Screams mixed with the chopping blades with the whine of incoming rounds. And above it all, Frost's voice finally broke across the comms, briefly, sharply. "Command, this is Frost. Extraction corridor viable. I repeat, corridor clear. Get them out, all of them." Colonel Blackwood's voice crackled back, rough with something between relief and shame. "Captain Frost, we hear you. We're bringing them home." Then her comm went silent again. She had no interest in debate, no interest in orders, only the mission. Another shot cracked, another enemy fell. And still they kept coming. "Captain," Beckett hissed, pulling her sleeve, "look." Over 50 hostiles surged up the slope toward their position, firing wildly, desperate to silence the ghost who was unraveling their entire operation. The stone around them exploded in shards. Bullets tore gouges inches from their faces. Frost kept firing, calm, steady, surgical, "Keep spotting." "Damn it, you're bleeding." "Keep spotting." Her command cut like a blade, and Beckett obeyed, eyes pressed to his scope, calling windage and distance even as his chest heaved with fear. The helicopters cycled in and out, like vultures dipping into hellfire, dragging men into their bellies and lifting them skyward. Each time one lifted, another descended, and the valley raged harder. 250 extracted, a voice shouted in Blackwood's headset. 312 out, 98 wounded aboard, another pilot reported. Every number hit like a blow to the chest. The impossible was happening. Men who had been written off as operational casualties were now alive, loaded onto birds carried toward light. But with every number, the risk to Frost grew. Through satellite feed, operators at the forward base saw it, the wave converging on her perch, the tightening noose. Colonel Blackwood's throat dried. QRF redirect to Frost's position. Now. Sir, she'll be cut off before we reach. Get to her. But Frost already knew. She saw the swarm converging, the end drawing near. She reloaded her last full magazine, sliding it home with calm precision. This is the line, she murmured under her breath, eyes locked through her scope. Her shot cracked. One hostile fell. She shifted, fired again. Another dropped. Each kill carved seconds into eternity. 452 extracted, the ground officer reported. 28 still inbound to LZ. Riker staggered toward the last helicopter, his body half broken but his voice unyielding. No one boards until the last man, in. You hear me? No one. The pilot shouted back, we're taking fire, we need to lift now. Riker's eyes burned with fury. Then lift when she's on this bird. Frost fired again. Her last magazine was running dry. Beckett looked at her, desperation in his eyes. Captain, it's almost over. She pulled the bolt back, chambered her final round. Her cheek pressed into the scope one last time. Not until every one of them is out. Her rifle cracked, echoing across the valley. Then silence. Her weapon clicked empty. The enemy surged, 50 men closing in, gunfire raining down on the ridge. Dust swallowed the air. The sky thundered with helicopters. And in that moment Captain Ezrain Frost, alone, cut off, her rifle empty, rose to her knees, sidearm drawn, body framed against the burning horizon. She fired, each shot deliberate, even as return fire ripped into the stone at her feet. She fought not for survival but for time. Time for the last 28 to reach salvation. In the command helicopter, Blackwood's voice broke through the comms, raw, furious pleading. QRF move. Get to Frost, now. The quick reaction force fought like men possessed, charging through enemy lines, grenades shattering cover, rifles blazing. They clawed toward her position, each step soaked in blood. And when they finally reached her, she was still standing, wounded, bleeding down to her last magazine, but still firing. The QRF leader grabbed her by the arm, shouting over the roar, Captain Frost, time to go home. Her first words, even as medics swarmed her, weren't about herself. Her eyes locked on the valley, on the helicopters lifting skyward. Did they all make it? Everyone, the QRF leader said, voice breaking. All 480, thanks to you. Only then did she let them carry her toward the waiting bird. As the helicopter lifted, her vision blurred. She caught one last glimpse of the valley, the ridge, the fire, the smoke. And the knowledge settled in her chest like truth carved into stone. She had done it. She had saved them. All of them. What happens when the people you saved refuse to let you walk past them unseen? The rotors of the last helicopter thundered into the night sky, carrying task force echo out of the valley that had nearly become their grave. Inside, men groaned under the weight of wounds. Medics rushed between stretchers, and silence hung heavier than any words. It was not silence of defeat, but the silence of disbelief. They were alive. Every single one of them. Colonel Blackwood sat strapped in, headset pressed to his ears as status updates flowed in. All birds accounted for, 480 souls aboard, 0 left behind. The colonel closed his eyes, the words sinking like lead and light all at once. He had nearly condemned them. He had spoken aloud the words, operational casualties, as if human lives could be filed away like failed assets. And yet, because one woman had refused, those words no longer stood. He looked across the cabin, his gaze falling on Master Chief Beckett, bloodied but alive. The older man's eyes were locked not on the colonel, but on the stretcher near the rear, where Captain Ezrain Frost lay. Her uniform was torn, soaked through with blood. Her face pale, jaw clenched. Medics worked with quiet urgency, pressure bandages sealing holes, morphine whispered into her veins. She stared at the ceiling as if she'd already made peace with what might come next. When Blackwood's gaze lingered too long, Beckett's eyes snapped toward him, hard as stone. No words were needed. The message was clear. Don't you dare forget whose blood bought this miracle. The colonel swallowed the guilt down like broken glass. The helicopters thundered into the forward operating base, rotors blasting the tarmac. It should have been chaos, medical teams rushing, commanders barking, stretchers rolling. But as the first Black Hawk touched down, something happened that no one expected. The men of Task Force Echo, those who could still stand, formed. One by one, as each helicopter landed, men limped into formation, bandaged, bleeding on crutches, still dragging IV lines. They ignored medics trying to push them toward triage. They ignored the weight of their own wounds. They stood shoulder to shoulder until all 480 of them formed a perfect, silent line along the landing zone. When Frost's helicopter finally descended, its ramp lowering, every man stood at attention. On the stretcher, her head turned, eyes widening faintly as she saw them. A wall of battered men, their bodies screaming but their backs unbent. Their hands lifted in unison, a salute that carried more weight than any medal. The air was electric, no words, no chants, just silence that roared louder than thunder. Colonel Blackwood stepped forward, his boots echoing against the concrete. He met Frost as she was carried down, his voice tight, shaking with a truth he could not disguise. "Captain Frost," he said quietly, bending close enough for only her and Beckett to hear, "I owe you an apology and my deepest gratitude." Her lips cracked into something that might have been a smile if not for the blood loss. Her voice was soft, nearly lost beneath the blades overhead. "Just did what anyone should have done, sir." But they both knew it wasn't true. Most would have followed orders. Most would have let the 480 die, hidden behind the shield of protocol. She had carried the weight that others wouldn't touch. As medics lifted her stretcher past the formation, the men of Echo didn't break their salute. Not one of them lowered their hand until she was inside the medical bay. Only then did the first voice break the silence, a whisper among brothers, "Never left behind." The phrase caught, passing down the line. Soon, every man was repeating it under his breath, as if speaking it made it real. Never left behind. Hours later, the base was quieter. The wounded were in triage, surgeries underway, morphine dulling the worst. Blackwood sat alone in the command tent, the glow of the monitors flickering across his face. The tactical display that had once shown blue dots swallowed by red now sat blank, the battle logged as complete. But the real battle wasn't finished. General Wainwright's face appeared on the screen, cold and sharp. "Colonel Blackwood, you authorized an operation in direct violation of command orders. You will face review." The colonel's voice was steady, his guilt transmuted into resolve. "If review is the price of 480 lives, I'll take it." "Captain Frost will face court-martial," Wainwright snapped. "Her actions compromised." "Her actions saved them," Blackwood cut him off, his voice rising for the first time. "You can bury her under paperwork, you can strip her rank, but you cannot erase what she did today." The silence that followed was long, heavy, until another face appeared on the screen, the Secretary of Defense, Lancaster. "General Wainwright," he said, his tone iron. "That will be enough. The President has been briefed. Captain Frost's actions will not be buried, they will be honored." Wainwright's jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. Lancaster's eyes shifted to Blackwood. "Colonel, prepare your statement. The world will know what happened here." The screen went dark. Blackwood leaned back, exhaling for what felt like the first time in days. He had spent years measuring missions by numbers, balancing lives against probabilities. But when he closed his eyes, All he could see were the 480 men standing in perfect formation, saluting the woman who refused to leave them. It would haunt him, it would save him, both at once. In the medical bay, Frost drifted in and out of consciousness. Her body was weak, but her mind kept replaying the valley, the faces of men she had seen crawling toward the corridor, the look in Riker's eyes when he realized someone hadn't abandoned them. She remembered every shot, every second, every choice. And with each memory, she asked herself the same question. Would she have done it again, knowing the cost? Her heart answered before her mind could. Yes, every time. By morning, the base was alive again with controlled chaos. Transports prepped to evacuate the wounded to Germany. Intelligence officers scrambled to sift through the shattered remains of the enemy force. Pilots repaired bullet-riddled airframes. But amid the noise, a quiet ritual began. The SEALs of Task Force Echo gathered outside the medical bay, not with rifles but with patches. They had taken strips of cloth, torn from uniforms shredded in the valley, and stitched crude numbers across them. 480. Each man wore his patch high on his chest, not as regulation, not as decoration, but as promise. When Frost was wheeled outside to be transported, she saw them again. 480 men, battered and scarred, everyone alive, each one wearing the same mark. Riker stepped forward, his side still bound, his steps uneven but his posture unbroken. He held out one of the patches. His voice, though rough, carried like steel. "Captain, we made this for you." She looked at it, simple, crude, imperfect. Yet it carried more weight than any metal ever could. With trembling hands, she pinned it to her uniform. And for the first time since Coronel, since the ghosts that haunted her nights, she felt something rare. Not just relief, not just survival. She felt peace. Because she hadn't just saved 480 men. She had saved a truth too easily buried. That no one ever was expendable. What does it mean when courage collides with protocol in front of the whole world? Months had passed since the valley. Captain Ezrain Frost's body carried the proof, a limp that would never leave, scars that stretched beneath her uniform, unseen but unforgotten, nights broken by echoes of gunfire that only she could still hear. Recovery had been long, grueling, but she refused to be idle. When she could no longer move without pain, she taught. When she couldn't fire her rifle, she lectured on wind, angles, patience. Her body weakened, her mind sharpened. And always she wore the patch 480 stitched in uneven thread, pinned just above her heart. The men she had saved visited in waves. Some limped, some wheeled, some leaned heavily on crutches. They never stayed long, never said too much. A hand on her shoulder, a nod, a silent acknowledgement, each one different, yet each carried the same weight. They were alive, because of her. But Frost did not feel like a hero. Heroes didn't close their eyes and see the ghosts of 2 Rangers from Coronel who had not made it out. Heroes didn't wake in the night and wonder if the rules they broke would one day cost someone else their life. Still, the world would not let her fade into anonymity. 1 year later, she stood in the grand hall of the Pentagon, her dress uniform pressed, her medals already heavy on her chest. Cameras clicked. Reporters whispered. Rows of distinguished uniforms and dark suits filled the chamber. At the front, the Secretary of Defense, Lancaster, stood tall, his voice echoing. "Today, we honor extraordinary courage in the face of impossible odds. But more than that, we honor the moral compass that pointed true when protocols led us astray." Frost stood at attention, her chin lifted despite the weight in her chest. The Medal of Honor gleamed in Lancaster's hands as he stepped forward. He placed it around her neck, the ribbon brushing against the simple cloth patch she refused to take off. The applause thundered, the hall erupted, cameras flashed. But Frost's eyes didn't search the audience for politicians or generals. They found the row of men standing in the back. 480 SEALs, scars visible, uniforms immaculate, every one of them wearing the same patch, 480. No one left behind. They saluted in perfect unison. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to hold steady, but inside the weight of the moment pressed deep. This wasn't about medals. It wasn't about her. It was about what had been proven true on that ridge. Lives were not numbers. Brothers were not expendable. After the ceremony, the hall emptied slowly. Frost remained at the front, her limp noticeable now as she stepped down from the podium. Colonel Blackwood, now retired, approached her. His hair was grayer, his shoulders heavier. "You changed how we define acceptable losses, Captain," he said quietly. "No one will be abandoned again." She searched his face, the lines of guilt carved deep, the eyes carrying a weight she knew too well. "I hope you're right, sir." His gaze didn't falter. "I know I am, because I watched what happens when someone refuses to obey. You forced us to see the cost of our own calculations." She didn't answer. She only nodded once, then turned away, the metal heavy against her chest. But weight alone did not make it right. Weeks later, at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility, Frost stood in front of a new class of SEAL candidates. Their faces were raw, their bodies beaten by months of relentless training. Among them stood several women, inspired by the story they had heard whispered in barracks and chow halls. Frost's voice carried across the room, calm, even. "You've been taught to follow orders. You've been conditioned to trust the chain of command. These are good things, necessary things, but there will come a moment in your career when the system fails. When protocol tells you to abandon someone, when orders demand you accept loss." Her hand brushed unconsciously against her leg, where the limp remained a permanent reminder. "In that moment," she continued softly, "remember why you're here. Not to obey blindly, not to protect systems. You're here to protect each other." The room was silent, not because they had been told to be, but because every word sank deep. Later, as the recruits filed out, one lingered, a young woman, nervous but resolute. "Captain, weren't you afraid, defying orders knowing you face court-martial?" Frost studied her, the weight of the question pressing hard. "I was more afraid of the alternative, of living with myself if I'd let them die." The recruit nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. That night, alone in her quarters, Frost removed the medal from her uniform. She set it on the desk, its polished surface catching the lamplight. Next to it lay the patch, faded, frayed, unofficial. One was earned by following recognition, the other by defiance. She picked up the patch and pinned it back on. Because medals told stories the world wanted to hear, but the patch told the truth. And deep down, Frost knew the truth was what mattered most. But truth was dangerous. Already, whispers had begun, generals questioning if her actions had set a precedent, advisors worrying that operators would think they could ignore orders in the name of conscience. Lancaster himself found her weeks later, during a quiet evening at Arlington Cemetery. She stood by two gravestones in Section 60, the names of Rangers she hadn't saved in coronal etched in cold marble. "I knew I'd find you here," Lancaster said gently, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She didn't look at him. "I come every year." "I know, just as I know you visit the ones who remind you of what failure costs." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of trees. Finally, Lancaster spoke again. "The President wants to create a new unit, Joint Task Force, specialized rescue operations, for the cases where conventional command says extraction is impossible." Frost's eyes narrowed, finally turning to him. "A unit built on what happened in Nurston." "No," Lancaster replied. "A unit built on what should have happened long before that. A unit that makes sure no one left behind isn't just a phrase, it's reality." She studied him, the offer heavy. "Why me?" His answer was simple. "Because you've already proven you'll make the right call, even when it costs you everything. And because 480 men are alive to prove it." For a long moment, Frost said nothing. She looked back at the gravestones, at the silence of sacrifice that no metal could erase. Then she nodded. When do I start? What happens when defiance becomes the doctrine of an entire generation? 5 years after the Valley of Nurston, Major Ezrain Frost stood in a dimly lit briefing room of a classified facility. The air smelled of oil, steel, and anticipation. 20 operators sat before her, men and women pulled from SEALs, Delta, Rangers, Air Force Pararescue, even allies from across oceans. Everyone hand-picked, not for medals, not for resumes, but for something harder to measure. The courage to defy. Frost looked at them, her limp still faintly visible as she stepped to the front. Her voice carried low, calm, as if she were speaking directly to each one in turn. The unit you've joined doesn't exist. Neither will the missions we take. You were chosen not only for skill, but because you understand a truth command too often forgets. Human lives are not acceptable losses. She clicked the remote. The screen behind her flickered to satellite imagery. Mountains, ridges, hostile forces tightening around 2 missing CIA operatives. 48 hours ago, they were declared casualties. Command called extraction impossible. We disagree. Murmurs spread, eyes sharpened. This is not training, she said. This is your first mission. Her XO, Master Chief Beckett, still by her side after everything, leaned forward, his voice carrying a hint of a grin. One question, Major. What are we calling ourselves? Frost allowed the smallest smile. She tapped the patch sewn onto her shoulder, 480. The words beneath it, no one left behind. Figure it out. Hours later, under cover of darkness, 2 MC-130 Talon aircraft knifed through black sky, hugging terrain so low the wings skimmed treetops. Inside the lead aircraft, the operators checked weapons in silence. Frost moved down the line, adjusting straps, meeting eyes, steadying nerves. Remember, she said, her voice a thread in the roar of engines. We succeed because failure isn't an option. Those people on the ground believe they've been abandoned. Our job is to prove them wrong. The jumpmaster called out, 2 minutes to drop. The cabin glowed red. Frost stood at the head of the line, parachute strapped, rifle secured. Her pulse steadied. Her breath slowed. And when the light turned green, she stepped into the void, the rest of her unit following her like shadows. They fell through darkness, parachutes opening silently, their descent ghost-like. Landing in dense vegetation, they moved with precision, no words, only signals. Frost took point, her limp no hindrance to the focus in her stride. At the perimeter of the compound, she scanned through thermal optics. Rebels circled the trapped aid workers, waiting for dawn to make good on their threats. Alpha Team, overwatch here and here, she whispered. Bravo with me. They moved, ghosts again, through a drainage culvert into the compound, past terrified medical staff clutching improvised weapons. Frost's voice was calm, steady. United States military, we're here to get you out. Dr. Holloway, the lead physician, stared in disbelief. We were told no one was coming. Someone was wrong, Frost replied simply. The extraction was fast, brutal, silent. Overwatch teams cut down advancing rebels with suppressed fire. Bravo team guided terrified civilians into formation. Frost herself carried a child, her arms steady despite the burn in her shoulder. At the clearing, the MC-130s descended, engines roaring. Rebel forces surged in pursuit, bullets slashing the night. Frost turned, raised her rifle, and unleashed the calm violence of precision. Her unit mirrored her rhythm, a shield of fire and discipline until every last evacuee was aboard. Beckett pulled her onto the ramp as the aircraft lifted, fire exploding behind them. Dr. Holloway clutched her hand, tears in his eyes. They told us it was impossible. Frost only shook her head. Impossible is just a word. Hours later at the hangar, Admiral Lancaster, no longer Secretary of Defense but returned to uniform, waited. He said nothing at first, only watching as aid workers were escorted to safety. Then he turned to Frost, his voice quiet. "That patch of yours, it's spreading. Other units are wearing it. Other branches are adopting it. Do you know what you've done?" She didn't answer. "You've changed doctrine," Lancaster said. "No one left behind isn't just a slogan anymore. It's the standard." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "You did more than save 480 men. You saved the soul of the military." Frost's gaze drifted to her team, moving with quiet efficiency, already preparing for whatever came next. Her lips pressed thin, her eyes heavy with the knowledge of what it had cost. "Then we keep proving it," she said softly, "one impossible mission at a time." Years later, at the Naval Special Warfare Training Command, Frost stood at the podium for another graduating class of SEALs. Her hair had more streaks of gray. Her limp had not faded, but her voice carried stronger than ever. "You've been taught to follow orders," she said, scanning their young faces. "You've been taught discipline, trust, obedience. These things matter, but there will come a moment when the system fails, when orders and conscience collide, when someone tells you that acceptable losses are acceptable." Her hand moved to the patch still pinned on her chest, 480. "In that moment, remember, we are measured not by the missions we complete, but by the people we refuse to abandon." The room was silent, not because silence was required, but because it was earned. Afterward, a young lieutenant approached, nervous. "Major Frost, is that really how you knew? In Nurston, you didn't know you'd succeed, you just couldn't accept leaving them." Frost studied her carefully, then nodded once. "I didn't know if I could save them. I only knew I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try." The lieutenant's eyes softened, understanding dawning. Frost placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice steady. "True courage isn't about fearlessness. It's about finding something that matters more than fear." 2 years later, Frost stood at Arlington, Section 60. Families gathered, flags waved softly in the breeze. Children held flowers at the foot of graves. Beckett stood beside her, older now, his voice gravel. "You never miss a year." "Neither do they," Frost replied quietly, nodding at the families who returned again and again, carrying the weight of sacrifice. Behind them, Lancaster's voice carried. "The President asked me to tell you, Task Force 480 is now permanent, official, global. Your patch is doctrine across every branch." Frost said nothing. She only traced her fingers along a headstone, the name of a ranger she hadn't saved years before. She whispered softly, so only the stone could hear, "They'll never be left behind again." That night, Frost sat alone in the hangar, her gear laid out before her. Another mission awaited, another impossible extraction, another chance to prove the promise wasn't hollow. Her phone buzzed. A message: humanitarian aid workers trapped, hostile forces approaching, classified as operational casualties. She stared at it, then pinned the patch to her chest again, 480. Her limp barely noticeable, she rose, her silhouette sharp against the lights. She spoke aloud to no one, her words like a vow to the silence itself. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." And with that, Major Ezrain Frost walked into the night, ready once more to do what others said could not be done.